One of the best parts about dragging your friends and family into Warhammer 40,000 is that it makes holiday shopping pretty easy. My brother is a huge Salamanders fan, second only to Astra Militarum in fact, but the only problem is that that faction only has two unique characters. One, Adrax Akatone, is the captain of the Third Company, the other, Vulcan Histon, is the current Forge Master, and despite being one of the only two characters Salamanders have, he's still stuck in good old Finecast resin. At least he didn't end up going to a fortress monastery upstate like Gabriel Seth did, if you know what I mean. But this does give me an opportunity. Since the Salamanders don't have a current Chapter Master model, I have the chance to make my own. And while I'm at it, I can give my brother a 100% unique model that no one else has as a Christmas present. My name's Colt, this is Gone Hollow Minis, and today we're finally bringing Chapter Master Tushan to the tabletop. Now the process of actually making this model is probably the most important thing here. Don't worry, we'll get to painting later, but I think this conceptual step often catches people when they start getting into kit bashing. While Tushan doesn't have a current model, or even an older one as far as I can tell, there are a few key aspects of his that have been established in the lore, so let's start with those. Firstly, let's figure out the armor. Tushan's armor is just described as being artificer armor, which isn't the most descriptive thing in the world. From the one picture of him, it looks like it's customized Mark 7 armor to me, but I'm pretty much going off of this one picture. That said though, I think I'm going to put Tushan in Gravis armor. Firstly, it makes for a bulkier, heavier silhouette worthy of a Chapter Master. Secondly, in minis like Marnia's Calgar, the Artificer armor to Gravis armor pipeline is already, unfortunately, well established. But third, Gravis armor is my brother's favorite pattern of Primaris armor, so it seems the obvious choice. Now, further than that, there are three more key features that Tushan needs to have. One is a Fire Drake mantle, the pelt of a dragon-like creature native to Nocturne, and a symbol of the Salamander's First Company. Second is Prometheus, a flame weapon that I honestly can't find too much more information on. The third piece of war gear is a hammer, or rather one of two hammers. Tushan wields both Stormbearer and Deathfire. Stormbearer is a thunder hammer made with a fragment of one of Vulcan's old weapons, while Deathfire is a weapon that Vulcan himself used. I couldn't find too much info on Deathfire, at least not without trawling through an entire novel myself. It's described as a power weapon, I know, and seeing that it's been wielded by Vulcan, and that it belongs to the Salamanders chapter, I feel like a hammer is kind of the safe bet. And since Stormbearer, or at least the weapon that I assume is Stormbearer, kind of just looks like the standard Primaris Thunder Hammer, I think going with Deathfire will be a more interesting option. But okay, so we're going for a Gravis character model, with a scale pelt, a massive ornate thunder hammer, and a relic flame weapon somewhere on his body. Bonus points if we're able to work in that power fist that appears in his one piece of artwork. I could have gone with a generic Gravis captain as the base for this conversion, but that felt a bit pedestrian. Instead, I picked Ironfather Phyros. His bulkier armor will fit the Salamander's aesthetic, and that big old axe haft will be a great base for Deathfire. This character model goes together more or less like a regular Space Marine, which is lucky because some character models are a nightmare of specifically sculpted puzzle pieces. Now, since this model is in fact meant to be an Iron Hand and not a Salamander, I've got some work to do up front. Namely, I've got to get rid of all the little skulls and cogs that are everywhere. And I mean everywhere. Despite spending an hour on this step alone, I still managed to miss two little cogs that hold the parchments on his belt. I don't think it'll be a huge issue in the long run. Salamanders like to build stuff anyway too, but just kind of annoying to spend that long and still miss something. But anyway, after clipping out all of the problem pieces, I spent time carefully removing all of the Iron Hand's iconography. This started by snipping a good chunk of the material away, being careful not to get too close to the base plastic. I didn't want any gouges or scrapes, especially over some of the nice rounded parts. Next, I moved on to a sanding stick. These have two different grits on them, and I used both to smooth down the parts as well as they could. After that, I hit them with some high grit regular sandpaper. This was important as the sandpaper could conform to the surface better than a sanding stick could, giving me a more finished end result. Lastly, I hit each part with a quick layer of plastic glue. This not only picks up some of the stuck sanding dust, but should give us one last layer of smoothing. This was done on every detail that I didn't want, from the boots to the backpack to the pauldron. I didn't end up using that pauldron, so that was a bit of wasted time, but it's practice, I guess. Make sure to spend some extra time on this. It'll really help our painting steps later. Now, with the mini cleansed of other chapter symbols, I could assemble some of the bits together. I made sure to dry fit everything so that I didn't end up assembling something that would later block my progress. Mainly this was just the torso and the legs at this point. This helps me get an idea of what pose I'll be working with without going too far in the building process. Okay, now for the arms. I tried a few options here, both regular Tacticus arms and larger Gravis arms, until I found the right fit. The right arm ended up being from the Blade Guard kit, both because the shoulder was the correct size for Gravis pauldrons and because I liked the inclusion of the Indomitus cross on the vambrace. The left arm was a little trickier. I had fewer options for this one, since I wanted to include Tushan's Power Fist. I tried an Intercessor Fist, but it was just too small. But luckily, I still had a regular Chain Fist left over from the new Terminator kit. It would take a bit of work, but I ended up settling on using this fist with a leftover Inceptor arm. Now onto the weapons. For Tushan's Flamer, I wanted to echo the look of the Flamestorm gauntlets that aggressors have access to, so I wanted to attach it to his Power Fist. Not to mention, I don't really know how he would use a regular Flamer with the big old Power Fist anyway. This led me down a bit of a rabbit hole though. I knew that the Terminator Power Fist was my best bet, but I also had this Flame Gauntlet backplate from the Aggressor kit, since I built mine with bolters. Since this would be the easiest and most seamless option, I tried making this work. It didn't line up perfectly, but I spent about an hour of sanding, trimming, whittling, and shaving to see if I could get the parts to line up. Bad news. They didn't. So after accepting that the easy route was not, in fact, going to be easy, I just went and used a regular Terminator Fist backplate. And I just decided to add the Flamer by hand. This was just a leftover hand Flamer from some Intercessor kit or another. I carefully trimmed it away from the hand, scraped off some of the lower details, and attached it to the Power Fist. Probably noticed that it looks a little bit weird to see a Flamer without a canister, but don't worry, we'll get to that later. With the fist done for now, I went ahead and found the correct Inceptor arm and attached everything together. Okay, now on to the other arm. This is the one that holds the hammer. I want the hammer to be a pretty big focal point of the model. While Primaris Thunder hammers are a little bit short and stubby, I want this one to be big and imposing. I started with Phyros' axe. That's quite a bit of haft here, and I like the butt spike at the end. The hands have to go though, so I carefully used my flush cutters to get a more or less flat cut above and below each fist. Then I took some time to carefully flatten out each joint, trying my best to get the crosshatch pattern to more or less line up. Once that was more or less done, I used my pin vise to carefully drill a small hole in the dead center of the haft. I had to be extra careful with this to not drill straight through. Once each part had a hole in it, I used a small bit of paperclip to pin each segment together. I need to split this haft again later to actually attach it to the hand, but I hadn't figured out the pose yet, and I kinda wanted to get this hammer done early, so here we are. With the haft done, I moved on to the head. I actually had quite a few options from across 40k and Age of Sigmar. In the end, I went with this hammer that I believe is from the Chaos Knight kit, or maybe the Varangard one. To be entirely honest, a lot of those hammers look nearly identical. I just spent a bit of time shaving away all the chaotic elements, from the little filigree arrows to the adorable little demon heads. Now to make this hammer even more Salamanders-y with a big old beastie skull. To be totally honest, I have no idea what this skull is. It looks dragon-y enough to me though, so we'll go with it. Funnily enough, after a bit of trimming, the skull fit pretty naturally against the hammer's butt spike. So once that joint was natural enough, I nestled the skull onto the hammer and glued it all together. Once all the pieces were pinned and glued together, I figured out where I wanted the hand to be holding the hammer, picked out a suitable hand from the bit spin, cut the hammer apart again, and reattached everything into its final pose. Okay, now that the pose is more or less figured out, it's time to get to the sculpting part of the kit bash. First was the greaves. The pull ends, the knee parts, have these little gear teeth on them, which is just a little bit too iron handsy for me. So I shaved down the little rivets and used some green stuff to smush between the teeth. Smooth it out with a silicone sculpting tool and the greaves were good to go, and they could be attached as normal. Okay, now onto the pauldrons. I want to extend the flange on the right shoulder plate into stylized flames, and while I'm at it, I don't think that a regular transfer would be good enough for a chapter master, so I might as well sculpt a full Salamander's head on the left pauldron as well. Am I that good at sculpting? No, not yet, but I gave it a shot anyway. I started with the chapter symbol, somehow the easier of the two. For this, I pretty much just smushed some green stuff onto the pauldron in a roughly salamander-esque shape. Then I used a silicone sculpting tool and a metal stylus to sculpt in the mouth, spikes, and eye. Somehow, the salamander here ended up looking happy, like he was smiling. I'm going to put this down to genetics, since all of the animals that my mom sculpts also come out smiling too. Thanks, Mom. But anyway, on to the next pauldron. This one was much more difficult, and I didn't think it turned out exactly how I wanted, but it's serviceable enough, I think. I tried to keep everything as flat and square as possible, though that didn't work out the best. Now with the green stuff drying, I can go ahead and work on some of these smaller applique details. First was adding this dragon head that I had got from the Free Guild Cavaliers kit, one of my favorite model kits of all time. This was sanded flat at the back and attached to the chest piece of the armor. Now to wrestle with the backpack. The one from the kit has all of these robotic arms and stuff sticking out that just aren't very Salamanders-y. So, using my hobby knife, I trimmed off the reactor vents and the bolter magazine. This left me with quite a few missing details. I replaced the reactor vents with a pear scrape from a leftover Tacticus backpack. They might be a little small, but I think it still looks fine. To cover the lower connections, I wanted to include 2 large Promethium canisters, both to echo the Flamestorm aggressors and to also connect the Power Fist Flamer to something practical. Attaching the canisters was easy and only required a little bit of cleanup. The tubes on the left side were bent and trimmed just enough to match with the Flamer on the Power Fist. Once that was done and the previous green stuff had dried, it was time to move on to arguably the most focal point of the miniature, the Fire Drake Pelt. If you saw my previous video where I tried sculpting Butcher's aprons onto Plague Marines, you'll probably know that me and sculpting fabrics don't get along quite yet. But luckily I have one trick that I've been sitting on to hopefully make this part the focal point that it deserves to be. It started naturally with mixing up some green stuff. I mixed this up and stretched it into a vaguely pelt-shaped sheet. This was then stuck onto the back of the model, careful to place the attachment points where they could be easily hidden later. This pelt is supposed to be dragon hide, so I picture it as a much heavier material than I've sculpted previously. This actually made things easier, as I didn't have to worry about the creases or ripples that lighter fabrics might have. I just made sure it draped over the details realistically and that it had some rough, jagged edges. Okay, now for the actual scales. I've been sitting on this idea for a while and I'm really happy I got to try it out. Once our pelt had dried enough to at least hold its shape a bit better, we're going to start applying our scales. I did this by shaping a tiny ball of green stuff, applying it to the sculpted cape, and then pressing the end of a paintbrush straight into the middle, making for a kind of red blood cell shape. This, with a bit more fiddling and a few repetitions, starts to look like clusters of dragon scales. Variation is key here. You don't want your scales to all be the same shape and size. To make it feel more natural, shape some that are larger, some that are smaller, and feel free to experiment with the shape. Make some circular, make some oblong, or even make irregular blobs. Really, it's up to you. The big thing we're going for here is texture. Fair warning, this can be pretty time consuming. Maybe there's a way to speed up this process that I was too stubborn to try, but it took me about an hour to get all the scales on this cape. That said, it's not necessarily hard, just a little monotonous, but I think the results speak for themselves anyway, so I think it's worth it. Now for the base. No character conversion of mine is complete without a loser. And since Salamanders are the good guys of 40k, what better match than 40k's most quintessentially evil faction, the Drukhari. I plucked this guy off of a raider, since the awkward pose worked for a less alive dark elf. And since Tushan has both a flamer and a hammer, I wanted to show the carnage of both. I took my poor little sadist and clipped his legs off, to make it look like Tushan had just, quite literally, swept them out from under him. To make it extra gnarly, I drilled a couple of holes in the stumps and added paperclip segments to be later painted as protruding bone. Now for the flames. These were done with little worms of green stuff, smushed and blended onto the ground and into the Cabalite's chest. This was my first attempt, and it could bear some improving, but I think it turned out alright in the end. That was really the last edition, however, and after I let the green stuff dry, I could move on to painting. My brother paints his salamanders with the classic base dry brush edge highlight style, which is not a style I'm overly experienced with, but I gave it a shot this time. This is also the first time that I've done this really bright green color on a Space Marine, so fingers crossed here. To try and give myself a bit of an advantage, I pulled out the airbrush. I basically just used this for all my base colors, starting with a nice medium green base tone, a darker shadow from below, and a brighter, more lime green from above. After that, I switched back to my comfort zone of brush painting. The first thing I did was glazing Baraknar Burgundy, my favorite paint ever, into the shadows and recesses. This makes our shadows a bit more interesting, with nice contrasting colors between the purple and green. The edge highlights were done with Army Painter Eternal Hunt, before a final highlight of Electric Lime was applied to the top edges. Now, one last major thing here. For a salamander, this guy doesn't have very many flames on him, so being as careful as I could, I freehanded some flame designs on the Power Fist and on both greaves. These were then outlined and highlighted with Vallejo Driven Grey and Army Painter Night Sky. Now for the pelt. This is where the extra effort in the sculpting phase really pays off. Because of how much texture we have here, we can make use of washes and dry brushing to do a decent amount of the work for us. It started with a base coat of Baraknar Burgundy again, applied over the whole pelt. After that, I hit it with a dry brush of Army Painter Basilisk Red, a nice purpley red tone. Then I hit it with a final dry brush of Army Painter Magenta, focusing on the more upwards facing scales. I also hit it with a wash of Rattling Grime mixed with Truescale Violet, and then hand highlighted some of the scales that stuck out, but honestly, if you're going for battle ready, you don't need to do this. After that, it was pretty much just a matter of finishing up the details and the base. To be entirely honest, I was kind of running a little bit close to Christmas time on this, so I didn't get much footage unfortunately, but it's pretty stock standard stuff anyway. But once all of that off-screen work was done, I was left with this. The Salamanders are one of the most loved chapters, both in the community and in the lore, even though they only have 2 unique characters on the tabletop. I think this guy turned out really, really well, and I can only hope that he'll be a worthy addition to my brother's Salamanders army. Thank you all so much for watching. I know this is a bit of a different painting style than you're used to seeing on this channel, but I hope at least some of the conversion stuff was worthwhile. Gone Hollow Minis has a lot of interesting stuff coming up in the new year, so make sure to stick around for that. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like and drop a comment to let me know what you think. Subscribe if you're not already, and if you want to keep in touch with all my lean green flamer-wielding machines. And until next time, be safe, be kind, and of course, don't you dare go hollow.